Hi, this video is going to give an introduction to Lair. Lair is a set of command line tools for working with generative AI. In this video, I'll give an introduction to some of the key concepts and features, and just an overview of what it is, who might want to use it, and that sort of thing. And the question of who might want to use Lair. This is really not for everyone. It's for people that like hacking at stuff. It's, people that have an interest in AI, trying out ideas with AI very quickly, software engineers, people who enjoy command lines. If you don't like the command line, this is not the tool for you. And there are similar tools out there, and some of them are pretty nice. Some of them are even more polished, but I went about things differently. I have different feature sets, so I think there is some value to some of what you'll find here, and so we'll go over some of that in this video. This video is made using version 0.8.0. Things might change. It's still all evolving. And I really recommend, if you want to watch just particular sections, that you check out this video on YouTube, where I'll link to each section so you could just jump to whatever is important to you rather than having to try to find it by hand. The original Lair had features that are not yet in the new one, and I'm working through little by little adding some of them in. I'm not sure if all of them will ever make it. The original had a whole agent framework, but I'm currently actually trying to add an agent framework into Lair, but I'm trying to do it a little bit differently. And I'm not sure what it's going to turn into just yet. The original one also had weird things like evolutionary programming, kind of using like genetic algorithm concepts, but only with natural language to express them. And that stuff was kind of fun, but the models weren't always good enough for it yet. So when models get better, I might port that over to the new Lair. And one very notable thing, if you look on my YouTube channel, you'll see that there's all sorts of AI generated videos that were made with diffusion models, and image diffusion models rather, instead of video models, that make some pretty weird videos. And none of that exists in the new Lair yet, but the old Lair was filled with stuff like that. Yeah, so who is Lair for? Lair is for people that like working with the command line. If you don't like working with the command line, this isn't the tool for you. It's for software engineers. It's for anyone who likes hacking at things. I wrote it for myself. It's the tool that I wish existed, so that's why I created it. And I added a lot of things in to make it really easy to try out things and experiment with AI, see what's possible, get very quick feedback and have low cycle time on trying out different experiments. And so that's what it's all about from my perspective, at least. Feature requests and bug reports are definitely welcome in the GitHub repository over at github.com/DougHaber/Lair. That's the official repo. No guarantees of anything being answered or developed, but I try here and there. It's a hobby project, so eventually things get worked on. So Lair has three main areas right now. Here, let's start with an overview here. I'll run lair -- help in a terminal just so you could see. So it's a standard command line tool, and it has three things: chat, comfy, and util. Those are the three subcommands that exist in the current Lair. Chat is a command line interactive chat interface with a REPL and all that, but it's more than that. You could even call the comfy stuff from Lair. You could do quite a lot there. It's just the whole REPL interface over any of the features of Lair that I decided to plug in there, and so that can do a lot, and we'll go over that in more detail soon. Comfy is a way of calling Comfy UI servers to run workflows, and Lair comes packaged with a bunch of workflows that are set up to interact in that way, so you can generate videos, images, do upscaling, things like that, all using a Comfy server. And Util is that's one that I've seen a couple variants of elsewhere. It's pretty much trying to make it so that LLMs work nicely on the command line. You could just run a prompt and get the output, or you could pipe data in. In Lair's version of it, you could also use tools, and you could use attachments. You could pass it a PDF file or an image file or whatever you need. So we'll go over all that in more detail in a little bit. So I think the next good thing to talk about would be the core concepts in Lair. So first off, there's configuration. And here, let me bring a browser over here so make it make more sense. So this is the main repo here. And if you go down to the configuration section here, there's a link, and this takes you to filessettings.yaml. Now, maybe this isn't the exact perfect place for everyone to see it, but for now it works. It's just where I started documenting what all the different settings are. And in Lair, most things are customizable. So, for example, you'll see even here, like this is the chat attachment syntax. We use double less than, double greater than kind of syntax on that. But if you don't like that, if you had a different attachment syntax you prefer, you could change it. But everything is customizable like that. Here's all the keyboard shortcuts, completely customizable. Yeah. For comfy, you could see there's all the defaults on this. Now, you're not actually meant to modify this file. This file just has all of the base settings, the default settings for when you run it, including the prompts, by the way. And these prompts, as you can see, are templated using Jinja 2, Python templating language. And so you could do things like here, it's actually getting a config key, and if it's set, doing one thing, and if it's not set, doing another. And you could do all sorts of fancy things. It's pretty powerful. Okay, modes might be the next thing to talk about. So if we go into here, you'll see this is my local config file. This is where you actually would make the changes. And in here, you could see that I have different sections. And some of these sections, like here, there's an inherit. So the SDXL Lightning actually takes all the settings from here and puts it in here. And if they exist in both, the setting in here will override the one that was inherited because it comes below and all that. Right now, you actually do need to have sections in order, meaning you can't import a section that wasn't defined above it. I wouldn't mind fixing that. It forces a weird order sometimes onto the file. But yeah, these sections can come in handy, and sometimes I'll put things like tools get their own section in the file that I'm using right now. Crocodile is actually the name of my desktop machine. Long story behind that, but it's but yeah, everything can have a description on a mode, and the description, it just shows up like if you do a list modes in the CLI, in the chat interface rather, it'll show you the description, which this isn't even a very good description because this is actually set up to use Olama over here, and that's what the description probably should be mentioning. But this lets me just have different ways of jumping around. So if I jump to my OpenAI mode, I'm suddenly using OpenAI. If I jump to Crocodile, I'm using my locally running on the Crocodile system Olama instance. Sometimes I have other ones for different purposes. Sometimes whatever you might need, but you can just completely change all the settings for different modes and then jump between modes very quickly. Back to the help, because I think it's worth pointing a couple things out. Before the subcommand, you can specify any of these options. The force color is like, let's say you were doing a pipe, like you were doing, like that kind of thing. Oh, no, the other way around. Sorry. Let's say you're doing pipe, like, into foo or piping out to another command, whatever it might be. It's going to detect it's a pipe and turn off escape codes. If you wanted to keep the escape codes, you could just use the force color option. Likewise, if you wanted to disable color without having to change anything in the configuration or anything like that, you could just use -C or disable color to turn off all escape sequences and just have plain text for everything. You could specify a mode, and then that'll set the default mode. Instead of using whatever the default is in your config, it'll use the one you specify here, which just clearly useful. And you could specify the model to use, which it's just a shortcut. But you could also do things, I hope I get the right names of these, but you could do like layer-s. I might have the name wrong, but let's just say it was model.name, and then I could put, DeepSeek, whatever. You could put whatever here like that just to set key value pairs from the config right here and override them. And you could repeat that too. You could have as many of them as you want, and so that's the basics of the command line calls. So I think the next useful thing to go into would be the chat interface. And like I said, it's called chat, but it's a full REPL for anything that you want to do. Couple things, you see the number 2 shows here and here. that's just the session number. Whenever you run Lair, it creates a new session. The sessions are persisted onto disk. They're stored. So if you exit and want to go back to your session, you can. You could see your model and mode, but this prompt is completely customizable, as is this. I mean, the toolbar is completely customizable. The prompt's completely customizable. They're just stored in the settings. And there's a whole lot of commands. So if you run /help, you could see all of the registered commands. And you could also see all of the registered keyboard shortcuts. And these are all customizable via config. So if you change something in the config, you could change them there. And there's the way to change things here. Oh, and by the way, you'll see everything auto-completes. Like as soon as I hit / it's starting to show me commands. And if I type sed, it'll auto-complete the this to help me find, whatever I might need over there. If you just run set without anything, it shows you just all of the keys and all of their values. The ones that are highlighted, that's just to tell you that they differ from the defaults. So anything that's not the default value is going to be highlighted. There's also list settings, and this is pretty similar to set. Like if you just run it, it's exactly the same as set, but it has other options that set doesn't have. And the reason they're separate right now is because autocomplete worked on set, and I didn't want to have to deal with fixing that for this. But you could specify a different baseline to compare against. That way, if you wanted to compare one mode against another's config, you can do that. And there's also like a show diff option. And you could also search. So if I just did like show me only tmux things, and then show me only the differences with tmux things, it's a very quick way of just getting answers like that. So you might notice over here these, if you've used a lot of old like IRC kind of things and a lot of old command line apps, these are just flags. And each one of these has a particular meaning. Like the L over here, the first one that's not on because it's not bright and it's in and it's not uppercase. That's multi-line editing, for example. So if you hit escape L, then you could turn on multi-line. And by the way, all of the keyboard shortcuts are nice because you could use them. You could be typing away and then switch the mode right there, and it switched immediately. So if I enable multi-line input, when I hit enter, it's not going to submit. Now I can put whatever I want here, and it won't submit until I hit escape enter. I think there's a couple other ways of doing that. Escape enter is how I do it. And yeah, and as you can see, this is just a normal chat interface. So maybe I don't want that anymore. So I turn that off, and then I could just hit enter to hit. So you could see there. And if I run history here, just to clear the screen first so it's more clear, you could see this. I've been playing with different styles that might be more clear for this. So how this appears might be different in the future, but this is one that just shows the formatted history. And you'll notice that there's markdown, there's code syntax highlighting. The M here actually means that markdown's enabled. So if we turn off markdown and then we run history, then we're going to see the raw response. And sometimes you do want to see the raw response. If you have markdown enabled, certain characters won't show up. XML tags might get eaten, so you can toggle that to easily see that. And there's a couple helpers too, like there's keyboard shortcuts. Like you could see the full chat history by hitting Control-X, Control-H, or you could see just the last two messages, which comes in handy when you're switching sessions and you just want to see context. So if I hit Control-X-H, it's just going to show me the last two messages. But if I hit Control-X, Control-H, now it shows me all the messages. And you'll notice there's a lot of keyboard shortcuts and little magic like that. And there's a lot of reasons I kind of refer to this as a bit of a hacker tool, because that's kind of the mindset I'm going in. I want to be able to do a lot with a few key combinations. And there's none of the low level is hidden. You could do things like this, and now you could actually see the raw messages as they actually appear. And they're normalized to an OpenAI format, just because that seems to be a pretty common, nice way of doing things. Model will tell you about the current model we're using, but if you do list models, it'll list out all the available ones. And if we do something like switching to mode OpenAI, you'll notice my prompt changed and the bottom changed when I did that. And I could keep chatting, and if I chat now, yeah, I'll just say hi. I don't have anything to say to it. But if I do that, this time the history continued, but I just switched the model to OpenAI seamlessly because it uses the same format, so it doesn't really matter. But if I do list models with OpenAI, and this is a full, GNU readline style thing with all the enhancements, so I could hit Control-R and search the history back to find my command. And if I do list models here, there's a whole lot more models with that. And of course, if I do model here, it auto completes and shows me everything, and I could switch. Don't want to switch to anything too expensive, but yeah, should give an idea of how things work there. So history editing, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this. Actually, I think it's easier to visualize with the messages view. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 messages here. And there's a few ways of editing it. One way is to use history slice. And history slice lets you use Python style slices. So if I do this, it'll only keep the first 2 messages, where if I do this, it'll remove the last 2 messages. And, it's the 3-part slice, that be familiar with if you've used Python before. And so it's a pretty powerful way of editing that. The third part is step, which isn't quite as useful, but you can, if someone has a reason to use it, you can find it. And so, I guess I'll just remove the last 2 messages. And so we kept 4 out of 6 messages there, and now you'll see that there's 4 messages. There's another way of doing it, which uses standard environment variables like your editor variable. And if you run history edit, now it's going to run this, and suddenly we're in Emacs and can edit it, whatever your editor happens to be, though, and we can edit it here. And so we could even change, its responses. Instead of being nice, maybe it's mean. Maybe it just says, go away. And now if I view the messages, the assistant told me to go away, and I could be like, that wasn't very nice. Yeah, and it tries to recover nicely, but yeah, you could just edit the history any way you want. Just be aware if you're using history edit. It can get really large if you're using attachments, and you'll see the full attachments in there. So if you attach a PDF file or something that's 1 megabyte, or you'll see a whole lot of base64 in there as well. So just be prepared for that if you're going to be editing it that way. Another feature that I'd like to show is the extract command. And this is just for pulling out sections of data from the response from the assistant. So maybe the assistant responds with something between an XML tag or within a code block, and if you want to get that to save into a file or whatever, this is a way of doing that. So to give an example, I'm just going to switch to another session that already exists, and let's just look at the conversation so far. Please give me an example of hello world in a few languages, and then the AI says, sure, and it gives 3 examples here. Now, if we just run /extract, it's going to take the first one and just give us that. If we do extract 1, it'll take the second one, and 2, it'll give the next one after that. So if you do, you can go backwards too, so you could do -1 to get the last one if you didn't want to have to count them out or whatever. You could also add in a file name on the end, and if you do that, it'll just save that section right into a file, just to make that really easy. A number of commands also can save to files. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but like the messages one, you could do messages.json, and then then if you go back to your shell and cat messages JSON, JQ, whatever, you could see, now you have a local copy of the messages JSON very easily. There's a bunch of commands that can do that. Like I think last response also does that as well, where you could just use that to see the last response, but you could also use it to save the last response right into a file too. One last note on the extract command, that it's completely customizable. So I don't actually remember the name of the setting, but I know it's like embed or something like that. So here it is. So chat embedded syntax. So you can see it's just a regex. It looks for either between answer tags or between code blocks, and that's the default. But if you had something else that you wanted to capture between, that's totally possible. You just make a change here. Next up, I'd like to show how attachments work. Let's start with an image attachment. So I'm going to go into the OpenAI mode. And I'm going to use the comfy command, which is the same as running layer space comfy, but the comfy command lets you run it from the REPL. And I'm just going to use image-p, which is prompt. I think you could also do -- prompt. A duck made out of vanilla ice cream, chocolate shell, and whipped cream. And it's going to run now. It's going to be a little bit of output usually. That's just noise from ComfyScript. And then there we have it. We have a nice duck. Looks delicious. I would eat that. And now I think that's going to be too big, the image. So let's just convert it. The default file name for output is output.ping. So I'm just going to use ImageMagick to make a smaller one instead. And if we go back in here, now I should be able to do something like, please describe this image. And I know some people will get mad that I said please. That's okay. Small.ping. Okay, a whimsical dessert that resembles a duck. Seems believable, so that worked pretty well. Let's do another one, but instead of doing that, so you could see we use the double angle bracket syntax. This does have home-dir expansion if you did things like tilde / whatever. It also has glob expansion of all types, including recursive globs. So I think maybe an example of that would be good. I'm just going to clear the conversation history, and let's clear the screen too. So maybe we'll take the Lair codebase and ask to please write up a brief document summarizing the key structure of this code. And then I could just dump it all in there. So I could do tilde/source/layer. We'll just take this directory. So everything in there, all the... Actually, let's want one. That would make more sense. Okay, and just the Python file. So that's going to take all of those files and just splat it right in there. Oh, you know, there's something else I should do before I do that. So I'm going to actually just... There's a setting when you're doing attachments that's pretty important. So it's provide attachment file names. By default, it doesn't get the file names. They take up extra space. If you're doing image stuff, it's giving it hints. It'll use what it sees in the file name to, answer the question rather than just what it sees in the image. But in this case, it's code, and the file names are pretty useful for it being able to talk to us. So we'll just set that variable there, and then we'll try this again here. So now it's going to upload all of the Lair code base, all the Python code in there, and give a breakdown of it. Code structure summary, main components. Yeah. Not going to look too closely. It's roughly believable. And we could ask questions. What would I need to modify to add a new keyboard shortcut in the chat interface? And so that's all in the context window now, so we should be able to just ask questions like this and get easy answers back. And I already don't like its answer. Maybe I shouldn't be using 4.0 mini though. For real things like this with code, 4.0 mini is not always the best model, but it's the cheapest. But you could see it's generally working, and if you were using a better model, you'd get answers that were actually pretty decent out of it. You could also use the attachments with other types of files. Any type of text file should work just fine. There's also PDF support. It just extracts the text from the PDF, but it works well. Yeah, I often dump entire, I'll grab a paper and then ask it to just summarize the paper, and then I'll ask follow-up questions, and that whole flow works really well. It does not look at the images in the paper, though, and that's important to know. It can only see the text. In Lair, there are two types of session management. There's the old style and the new style, and the new style They actually both have utility in different ways. The new style works with both the chat command and the util command, so you could start a chat session with with the chat interface and then continue it, or build on top with the util command, and that works pretty nicely. The old style is just serializing it. So, for example, if we just start a new session here, just to get something in there. Okay, so now we have a conversation in here, and so our history is going to look like that. If we use the old style, just uses save and load, so we could do save foo.json, and now we have a session written to foo.json. So if we do JQ, so you'll see the session that's serialized includes all of the configuration that's different. I actually should probably have it filter out inherit. It doesn't do anything though, so it doesn't do any harm. Same with description, but it stores all of the keys that are different from the default. That way you get the same exact configuration. It's not just the chat history, and it includes things like the model name, the mode that you're in, the last prompt to last response, so you can get the exact state that you left on there. And it also has the history, as you would expect. And of course, if you have attachments and things like that, it could get pretty big. So, and just so you could see, I don't think I showed this before, last response is just the answer from just what the model said in the last one, and everything above that you could see from last prompt. Last prompt gives you access to the raw version of what was sent to the LLM. So in this case, you get to see the system prompt and then the conversation up until the last thing that the user said. So it's sometimes handy if you're trying to debug things, especially if you're using templating in your system prompt or anything like that. So you could see exactly what it saw. So if we wanted to load that session now, let's just create a new session. I hit Control-X-N and I get a new session here. And I just did that so that it would be a clean slate. So now I could load foo.json. And if I look at my history, there it is. If I look at my last prompt, everything is exactly the way you would expect there. And I could bang on the keyboard, and if I was to hit load again, I just got a very quick rollback. And you could commit these to GitHub, you could pass them around, you could save them, you could use them for testing things. I find them useful when trying to come up with prompts for like agent kind of stuff, to build up the state there and then just try out the next step of what it might say, or try to modify this or edit history. And I could just keep trying things and rolling back quickly. The history edit stuff works for that too in different ways, but this is nice because it stores the full state of the configuration as well. So save and load are pretty straightforward, but sometimes you want better session management, and that's where the new style comes in. The new style is actually writing it to a database that's stored in the .lair directory. And you see that there's currently 3 sessions. We started in session 2 when we were dealing with sessions, and we saved that one and loaded it back to session 3, which is why they're identical. You'll notice that there's a title. It automatically generates titles. So, if we start a new session here, Control-X-N for the new one, and we say, tell me about ducks, I don't know. And after it gets a response, it's going to take the first 2 messages, or a truncated version of them if they're long, and then use that to generate a title. So ducks information. You can control a bit about how the titles are auto-generated in the settings and what the rules are on that, or you could turn off the feature entirely. The title here is just having a quick way of having some context about what the conversation is about, but it's only based on the first couple messages. If you didn't like the title that it gave, you could use session title for foo, and then we just set a new title. And then if we look at the sessions again, and I did that by hitting Control-X-S to see the sessions, and now my title is foo. So if you could name them yourselves manually too. What do you have here? Let's see. You'll notice there's also alias. So sessions all have an ID. The session ID is used by any session command. So if you wanted to session delete 3 and 2, we could do that just by using the ID. But if you wanted to switch sessions, you could use an ID or an alias. You could set an alias, same with the title. Like with the title, you could also do Control-X, Control-T rather. And Control X T brought up the tools. Control X Control T brings up the title for session 4. And so you could just put that in there. And now if I do Control X S, there's the title. If I want to set an alias, it's Control X, Control A, set an alias for session 4. And if I put foo here, now I've got that. So the nice thing here is now if I wanted to reference it, if I run the session command 1, it's going to switch me over to that. Running session alone gives you the list. You'll notice that the highlighted color, that just tells you what the active session is. But now I could either put in for or I could put in foo. They're both interchangeable at that point if you have an alias. There's also, I'm just going to create a whole bunch of sessions just to have more to look at there. There's also quick switch, Control X, so you just go like that, and it asks you to switch to session. By default, it's going to switch to whatever session was your last used one, or it has a little bit of an algorithm for trying to find the nearest one. So I hit Control XX and then enter. It'll just take me to the default of 1, but because 6 was my default, I could just quickly switch back and forth between them. I could reference them by names as well, so I could do Control XX foo. And if you're at this prompt to switch to session, if you hit tab, it will show you all the sessions, so you have a way of finding them. You could also use the F keys. I don't actually have these bindable to anything else. These are the only key combinations that I don't think you can change. But if you press F1 for F12, like if I press F1 there, it switches me to OpenAI, F2, F3, F4. The slight delay is because I have it doing a list models call on session switch. I might change that because I don't like the delay, because it could be instant without that. But you could see I'm just pressing F1, F3, F5, and it's switching me to the whatever number session that is. So that's another quick way of switching around. Sessions will persist. So if I exit Lair and then I run it again, Lair chat, and if I view the session list, you'll see though that certain sessions disappeared. Only the sessions that had messages were persisted. So session 1 and session 4 had messages, so they survived, and then it created a new session 2 here. That's not the same session 2 as over here, even though it looks similar. It's a brand new one. I have it prune out empty sessions. I could add a config flag if people don't like that. I just find that sometimes they build up over time, and it's just nice. We could make a command to prune the empty sessions and not make it automatic, and that would be pretty easy to change too. If there's a desire for that, just create a GitHub issue, and it's probably like 20 minutes of work if even. So I think that's pretty much it for sessions. I still use both styles. The save and load come in handy. They're just simple and straightforward, and the newer style is just great for persisting things and for working between the Util and the chat command. So you could use the chat command, build up a certain context, and then use the Util command. And the Util command does have a flag where it uses a session but does not append to it. So you could reference the session, get any information out of the context of the session, but not modify it. So you could have repeated Util calls using that session without modifying it. And it comes in handy sometimes. The next thing I'd like to talk about is tools, and Lair has support for a whole bunch of tools. Whenever I felt like the need for something, I implemented it. They're actually pretty easy to implement in Lair. And you can see this T down here in the bottom toolbar. That means tools, and right now it's disabled. If you hit Escape T, it toggles on, and now tools are enabled, meaning that information on tools will be sent to models. If a model does not support tools and you try to make a request that involves tools to it, that currently results in an error. There are ways of implementing that without using it, but if models aren't trained for tool usage, you're not going to get great responses unless they're a pretty big model anyway, so it's not always the most worthwhile thing. Right now, I've just let it return an error. So if you try to use a model without tool support, you get an error back, and that seems like a pretty reasonable way to go about things. Here, let's switch to OpenAI just to be fast about things. And notice when I switched, tools went off there, but that's using the mode's default settings, which does not enable tools. If we list out the tools with the list tools command, you notice none of them are enabled by default, but here are the tools that we have right now. And this is just the core of what I thought I needed at different points in time. File tool lets it access files on the local file system. You actually give it a directory a path, and that it's not allowed to work outside of that path. And then but if you give it this, then it could write files, read files, create directories, remove all the stuff you'd expect. The Python tool over here lets it run Python code inside of a Docker container. I did not give it a persistent like Jupyter notebook kind of style. Maybe that'll be a change for the future. Right now, it just runs one script, gets a response, and then the Docker container shuts down. The search tool uses DuckDuckGo search. It has two functions, one to search the web and the other to search news. It works pretty well, but it's using DuckDuckGo because they don't require an API key, but they do rate limit pretty heavily. So if you're going to use it more, then we probably will need to implement some other search engine with an API token kind of thing to make it possible to make a lot more calls than you can make with the DuckDuckGo one. But if you're doing a few here and there, it's just fine. And it has zero setup, which is pretty nice. And then Tmux tool, and that uses the actual Tmux, terminal multiplexer program to control terminals. So you could even have existing ones that it could connect to, or you can have it be able to create new ones. You could run any program. It supports screen-based programs. Like if you were running top, for example, it could just get a screenshot of the output of top. But it also supports line-based activity, like just reading out the new output to the terminal as a stream, and all that. With all these, there's a lot of little gotchas and things to know. It's all in the documentation. But the first thing you might realize here is everything's disabled. So we need to enable that by hitting. I hit Escape T. And now tools are enabled, the T lit up over here. And if we were to run list tools again, you'll see what's enabled here. And everything is not enabled. I often work with local models, and local models are often a bit dumber than the big ones you'll find like at the big AI providers. And if you give them too many tools, they get confused. And so I don't give everything by default. I only give really what I think it needs. And I also disable the ones that might be more dangerous, like having it be able to remove a directory. Like you'll notice that the file tool by default is read only, list directory, read file. It can't even write files, but if we wanted to enable that, everything's just settings. So if just to show you, like, I think it's tools. So here are all the tool settings. And like if you see, here's the Tmux settings, the search settings, everything's in here. And it's pretty straightforward to modify anything. But if you wanted to enable writes, you just change this setting over here, enable writes true, and then it can write. That can be dangerous, especially if you set up the path wrong. Like I have the path defaulting to temp layer. If you were to make it just / or something like that, then it would be able to write your whole file system, at least wherever it has access to. So it's good to be a little cautious about that. And the Python one actually runs in a Docker container. By default, it uses Python latest, but you could also make your own custom Docker image, and you could list out extra modules you're providing. So the default Python image is pretty much core Python modules, but if you wanted to provide NumPy and requests and things like that, you could install them in your own Python image, and then you just use this key to list out the extra modules, and then in the tool instructions it'll tell it that those modules are available, so that it knows from the start. Similarly with the Tmux ones, I originally had it able to run any command, then I changed it. Now there's a run command, and so when it creates a window, it can only run the command that's specified here. And I have it run things in Docker by default just because I like the containerized security, so I know that it's not going to be able to destroy my system, or hope that it won't. And but you could run anything. It doesn't have to be Docker here. And then this is just the description over here, which tells it what to do. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, let's try the search tool. The search tool is a nice, easy one because it's zero set up and just kind of works out of the box. So if you remember, like, so I just hit Control XT, by the way, just doing it for muscle memory, and that shows me the list of tools that are enabled. So with the search tool, we have both search news and web. Sometimes with the smaller models, you need to nudge them in the right direction, and I've just gotten in the habit, like telling them, use the Python tool to, if you tell them things like that, then they'll pick the correct tool. With the bigger models, it's less necessary. But we're using OpenAI here, and we could say, give me a brief summary of any noteworthy recent news in the world of AI. And then if all goes well, so you could actually disable this output if you don't want to see it, but by default, I have it enabled to show tool calls and their responses. It truncates a little, but it's just so that we're able to see what's going on. So you could see it just did a search news with the query AI. It got some responses. The responses actually include a whole lot of results. So it goes to each URL in the top search results, and it grabs a certain amount of text that's determined by the settings, and then it returns that over to the model, and then the model has that in its context window, and it can do a little bit of a write-up. So that's nice and easy and works well, and being able to search news in the web makes it able to know more about obscure topics. You should trust it about as much as you trust normal websites, maybe less, because it can hallucinate on top of that, but it works. If we clear the conversation history, the Python tool is great for math and things like that. Use the Python tool to, let's see, what should we have it do? Calculate compounded interest paid for a 10-year loan of $1,000 at a 5% rate. So it's great for mathy things. You could even give it some hints about what you want to say. Show me a table of the results by year with the total amount paid and what else? And interest paid columns. So hopefully this works. Okay, it called run Python. It wrote a little script, got an exit status of 0, which is great, and then it came up with a response, which for a $1,000 loan over how many years did I say? Over 10 years? Yeah, that actually, I think that seems believable. So total of $628 interest, and you can see that could be useful in a whole lot of ways. It could also, it's running in a Docker container. It does have network access, so there's a lot that you could do with that. So I think I'm going to skip the demos of the file tool and tmux tool. It's pretty much what you'd expect. It just works. The tmux tool can get finicky with smaller models that aren't smart enough to understand how to interact with terminals, but it works pretty well. You could find some videos online either on X or YouTube of it playing the BSD games Wump, hunt. So you got GPT-4o Mini hunting the Wumpus. And I think that gives a pretty good demo of it, but it's what you'd expect. It needs prompts with the tmux tool, just to be clear. Like you'd sometimes need to tell it things like when to use screen reading to get a screenshot as text, or when to use line by line. If you use the bigger models, it tends to figure it out, but the bigger models cost significantly more than the smaller models, so it's sometimes nice to just add a few words to your request to hint it in the right direction. Okay, so in the next section, let's talk about the comfy support. So Lair has a comfy subcommand, and if we look at the help for it, you'll see that there's these different workflows that are built in. It's not too hard to add more workflows, and I might add more over time. I actually think I have an outpainting. I think there's a branch for outpainting. There might be some others coming. It's just generally when I have a need for something, I add it, but it's pretty easy to add new ones. And these are Comfy UI workflows that run on a Comfy UI server, and then you get the outputs back over here, but it makes it pretty nice to work with from the command line. One thing to note with the Comfy workflows is that you need to have whatever the required nodes are. So here, let me just go back here to this, just to show. I believe there's actually a table in the help here. So if we go to Comfy, so this tells you what the workflow itself is based on and what the dependencies are. And so if you want to use the LTXV I to V, you need to have 3 different nodes to do that. LTXV prompt, you need to have these to do that. And some of these are because Comfy doesn't have built-in ways of doing things. Like I think the Comfy UI tooling, for example, is necessary in order to get images working as input, because it has a a node that accepts base 64 input, whereas Comfy doesn't provide any way of doing that externally, so Comfy script can't do it. Some of them have no dependencies, like image generation. It's all completely core Comfy, so that'll work out of the box. Same with this one, it's out of the box, but I might actually change that in the future because I'm using the standard save. So I think it might save WebP files or something like that. I prefer using Comfy UI Video Helper Suite to save because that gives you a much more powerful save function that supports multiple formats, so you don't just have to use WebP. So you do have to set up Comfy with the dependencies. That's general. If the workflow doesn't work from a standard workflow perspective, like if you were to pick a workflow here and go to it and drag it into Comfy and try it out, if it's not going to work in Comfy from there, it's not going to work with this because it's running through the same mechanism. So you do have to set up Comfy and install all the dependencies, meaning any of the nodes and models. And if you're using Comfy UI Manager, it's pretty easy to get the extra nodes installed, and the models are pretty easy to install as well. You just have to put them in the right places. So for a very basic example, like if we do layer image, each one of these is going to have a lot of things. Let me do that right now. So if I do layer Comfy image help, you could see there's a lot of parameters. Some of these parameters actually come from the settings, and there's more things to change in the settings than there are flags. The flags are just for common ones. The flags are helpful ones. If you wanted to change other ones, you might have to do -s, comfy.image.whatever, and you could change other things that aren't listed here. But all of the most common ones will be there. So let's actually make an output directory, and then we'll layer Comfy image, and I'll just give a prompt, and we just need something to, I don't know, we'll get an image of a cow, why not? And we'll output it to output cow.ping. Look right, I think. So now that's actually running on a Comfy server, and it completes, and now there should be a file here called output cow.ping. Let's see. There's our cow. Very nice. So it was that easy just to get that. But you could do other things too. Like if we did -r, we could tell it make 10 pictures of a cow, and it would automatically make cow 00001, 2, 3, 4, and that kind of stuff works really easily. You could chain LoRa's to have as many LoRa's as you want, and that's a very easy feature. I'll leave this to the documentation to get examples of, because there's images with examples too in the README MD in the repo. But this is just a way of making it very easy to call these workflows from the command line. In the original Lair, I didn't use Comfy UI as the backend. Instead, I used the diffusers library. I had Torch and SciPy, and I was doing a lot of things by hand, and it worked, and it was faster and better in some ways, but it had some major downsides that I was spending way too much time building those things out, whereas Comfy UI has already optimized things. They already have support for a lot. Having to do it all by hand was way too much of a pain. So it's pretty nice using Comfy. The way we're using Comfy is using something called Comfy Script. If you search for that, it's a library that lets you use Comfy UI from Python code. And it's a little bit hackish, but it's really awesome. And you can't really control the output. And I might have to either make some PRs against that or monkey patch it a little bit more than I already am to get rid of things like this, where it's using multiple threads even when it seems unnecessary to, and some of the threads have output that you can't capture. If you actually ran, just to show you, like if we ran this in debug mode, it will actually show even more output. This is output that the threads are writing. When you're not in debug mode, I just throw away the output. When you're in debug mode, I have standard out actually still go to standard out, but I can't control the threads, and so it's a little bit difficult there. If you do run into trouble, like things don't work right, using the debug flag is one way of potentially seeing the error, but there's another place, and this isn't a great workflow on how this works, but so you could try to debug flag to see if you could see an error from that. And like if you were to put an invalid value for one of these settings, you might get an error, and the error might not even show up clearly. And this is a limitation of ComfyScript, since you can't collect the exceptions back from the thread as the way it's currently set up, or if you can, I haven't figured out how. But the other place to look would be the Comfy UI output. So if you're running Comfy UI in a terminal, you could look at its output log too and see what it's saying there. And you'll usually be able to figure out what the problem was from that. Yes, this is pretty powerful. I'm not going to go into great detail. There's a lot more in the documentation. And the image one is actually using the default Comfy UI image workflow, the one that they'd give you as a default one, with a few modifications. But the documentation tells you what each of these workflows is coming from. Some of them are a little bit Frankensteined up and gluing different things together. But now we have, so just want to see it again because we have our cow. It's a very nice cow. If we wanted to create a video of that cow, we could do LTXV I2V, which is image to video. Oh, sorry, I keep messing everything up here. So here you could see that this has a whole bunch of different options for creating video. But in the easiest form, we could just do, oh, it's not example, it's output cow ping. And then we could do output file. And here you can control, the extension will control the format. So if we do cow.mp4, do I have that right? Oh yeah, I want it to be in the output directory. So this might just take a second because it's going to have to load the model. But notice that I didn't provide a prompt. If you do not provide a prompt, it automatically generates one. But now we have a output cow mp4. Oh, here, let me get that over here. I'll start over the video. And you could see we have a cow, but it's more of like a pan over a photo. Let's say we wanted to control that and give it more hints as to what we wanted it to do. So Lair Comfy, you'll notice that I had one here that's just LTXV prompt. So LTXV prompt, all that's going to do is generate the prompt itself. So if we do image output cow.ping, and we'll just let it write the output.txt, that's fine. What this is going to do is it's just going to create this output.txt. So why don't we just open it in an editor, output.txt. So you can see this is the prompt that it came up with. The video shows a white cow standing in a green field. LTXV requires very detailed prompts. So maybe we add in the cow moves naturally and moves, I don't know. And, just to get some activity going on in the image. LTXV is not the highest end model for these types of things. So we could provide the prompt from a file. Let me double check. It's -p is prompt file. So LTXV doesn't always follow. Some of the other models will be a lot better at giving you control over all the fine details from your prompt. LTXV it's a little sloppy, but you could just let it, it's really fast, so you could iterate quickly, and you could just set repeat to 10 and get a whole bunch of variants and pick the one you like best kind of thing, and that's how I've generally used it. So if we go here and we try the video now, so now our cow actually can move around, and so just by modifying that prompt here, one more try of the cow here from the beginning. So there is our cow. He's moving around now. So we took an image that we generated, and then we made a cow, and then we were able to create a video out of it. Let's see, what other comfy things would be nice to see? How about upscale? Upscale is probably the most useful from my perspective of the commands that are in here. It doesn't have very many options, but you just give it an upscaler that you want it to use. It'll default to this one here, but you could specify any upscaler. I have a link to one of the more common ones in the README-MD, but you can go to any of the websites that provide upscalers, and there's some that have a whole lot of upscalers and let you compare before and after images, and you can find the upscalers that are really good for very specific purposes. If you're not familiar, upscalers are good for several things, but the main use is, you could take an image of a certain resolution and double, quadruple, or 8x the resolution, things like that. And it's really good for that. And trying to fill in the gaps with AI so that the image still looks natural, even when it's a higher resolution. You're not seeing pixels. And the other thing it could do is restoring images. There could be images that are damaged in different ways, that are pixelated. If you have a model that's meant to handle that kind of stuff, models might be trained to take noisy images that have a lot of pixelated damage. Maybe they're really low resolution, and then create much higher resolution images out of them. And some of those are pretty amazing what they could do. So, and I'm just going to mention too, the recursive option here is really nice. You could just run that against a path and it'll upscale every single image file based on the extension in the path. Let's do a layer comfy upscale output cow.ping. So we have our cow.ping here. I'm just going to let it do the 2x one just to be fast for an example. So layer comfy upscale output cow.ping. Do I need to specify image name? Oh no, it just takes it from the prompt. So there we go. So it's going to, the first time it takes a little bit longer because it had to load the model, but it's still pretty fast. And here, let's just go in output, file cow star ping. So you could see we have two images, and this one is double the resolution. So if I have gnome cow star ping. So here's the original cow, and here's the new one. It might not seem much, so let's zoom in on his nose or something. So in the original one, you could actually see the pixels here. When you zoom in, you could see that it's made of these pixels. It's, the quality is kind of low at that zoom level. But if you go to the 2x one, we should be able to go in and have it be smoother much further. It still starts to pixel if we pixelize. If we really wanted, why don't we just do it? So if that didn't take as long as I thought. So if we, I'm just going to take this one. I'm pretty sure I have the 8x model here. Not sure if that's a good idea, but we'll throw it against the 8x model and see. I'm in the. That's what I get for modifying my prompt. I'm in the output directory already, so it didn't work. Okay, and now it's doing that. It just completed. This is actually a problem worth mentioning with the ComfyScript stuff. Sometimes it adds delays to things because it's waiting on the threads and things like that. And it's not as fast. When I had stuff running with diffusers, as soon as it completes, you're back in control. With ComfyScript, you have this async stuff and this thread stuff, and it's not handing control back immediately after things are done. So with the video diffusion, the image diffusion to create video stuff I did in the old version of Lair, unfortunately, with ComfyScript, you won't get the performance for that currently. There's no reason ComfyScript can't do that, but it just seems like when you call the wait function in ComfyScript, it often waits like an extra second or so, which is pretty painful if you're trying to do a batch of 1,000 things or something like that. You don't want to add a second to each one. So that's something that might have to be fixed in the future. Okay, so let's check out what we have now. So if we check our files now, you could see the resolution has gone way up now. And here's our cow. And I hit right, and it takes a little bit of time. Here's our, 8x cow. And if we zoom in now, it's pretty smooth much further in now. So you have to zoom in much further before it even starts showing the pixelization of that there. So I think that's a pretty good example of that. Yeah, that might be all for Comfy now. There are other things we could add. Nearly any workflow can be added. If you're really interested in something, bring it up in the issues. I'm happy to help somebody else implement it, or in some cases I might implement it myself. Just create a GitHub issue and we can get the conversation started. It's not that hard, but there's a lot of boilerplate that needs to be created for like all the parameters and all that kind of stuff. And so you have to make edits in a few files. Maybe in the future we can simplify that down so that adding workflows is more trivial. But it works pretty well. And with all of this stuff, because it's done programmatically, like even with LoRa's and stuff like that, it's just they just chain kind of nicely. You just have a loop in your Python code that goes through each LoRa and applies it, and it just works with ComfyScript. It's a nice tool, and the upscaling is probably the one that I use more than anything else, just to restore images and improve quality of stuff. Okay, next up, I'd like to talk about the Util subcommand. The Util subcommand is a general purpose tool for interacting with LLMs from the command line. It's meant to do one-shot tasks really easily, and also to be used for scripting. So it's designed to work with bash scripting and one-liners and things like that. So I think it'll be easiest to show with examples. It has a lot of features. It can use a lot of Lair's features already. So it could use attachments, including images, PDFs, text files. It could work with any of the tools that are available in Lair. It completely supports using sessions, the same exact sessions, the persistent sessions you'll find in the chat subcommand. You could jump between the chat subcommand and util subcommand. It doesn't care. A session for one is the same in the other. And it'll make more sense with examples, so I think we should just jump right into it. And just as a note, I've seen similar tools out here, out to this elsewhere. This is just my take on this style. So if we run layer util-i, that's instructions. The simplest example is just to ask it to generate something, maybe write a program, maybe do that. And in this case, I'm just asking it to write a poem about AI. And there's a system prompt that tries to encourage it to only return what's necessary, so you don't have to see here's the thing you asked for kind of responses, or any of that extra disclaimers or extra notes that it adds on top of things. So you just see exactly the content that you asked for, at least most of the time. That's the goal. Smaller models don't do as well as bigger models and on that too. So we got our poem. Bites dance on silicon dreams, whispers of algorithms stream. I'll let you read that on your own. And so that's just the most basic type of thing you could do. To give another example, let's say we went digtextopenai.com, and you see they have a whole lot of text records here in DNS. And we could do something like that, pipe it through layer util -p, which means allow it to read from standard in. So, in this case, it's going to read right out of the pipe over here. And then we could provide instructions this way. Please summarize these DNS records in plain English. List out each service referenced and list out anything unusual. And we'll see what it comes up with. It's running against, I think, a 32B model, so it should be capable of tests like this. And there we go. So it lists out all the different types of verifications that it sees based on this, and that there's a couple of repeats. There's 2 versions of the Atlassian domain verification and 2 different Uber ones, and also something unknown. And yeah, so that's an example of one way of going about it, but it can do a lot more. So if we do layer util help, you'll see it has, these are for getting attachments in, for bringing content in for various ways. You could use pipe, and you could use content and attachments. The attachment syntax supports globs, so you could do star dot whatever. You could do recursive globs like star star, and import all the source code in this repository. Totally works. If you do that, you'll probably want to include file names. Generally, you don't want to include file names unless you need it. It adds extra tokens for one, but more importantly, the file names will bias its thoughts on what's inside of anything. Like it'll see the file name and before it sees the content, and so the answers you get will be taking the file name into account. But if that's not concerning, or it's necessary to have the file names, such as with source code, you'd want to run this flag as well. Instructions, you can be provided the way I did with -i, where you just provide it as a string on the command line, or you can give it a file that has the instructions. By default, Markdown is disabled, but the system prompt for generating things has a conditional in it. And if you run the -m flag, it tells it, actually do use Markdown, and then it renders the Markdown. And I can give an example of that in a bit. This is for sessions. We'll go over that, and -T to enable tools. So you could see it's got some good functionality, and it's pretty easy to work with. I'm going to try something, and I'm not sure how well it's going to go. So I just prepared a sample of syslog records. I just grabbed a handful of records out just so there's something to give a real world or a more realistic real world example with. So let's say we want to have it write things out. We're going to use OpenAI to increase the odds of getting a working answer. And we could say, write a Python script that converts syslog entries into a JSON format, breaking down each component. Here is an example line, and I'm providing an example just to increase the odds that it actually works. Otherwise, I don't want the demo to go bad. So, and then let's t syslog2.json.py. Oh, syslog2.json.py. The t just splits it, so it'll write the standard out, and it'll also write to that file. So we'll be able to see it here, and it'll show up in the file. Okay, so I forgot to tell it to do one thing, so let's just try that one more time. Read a file name from the arguments list and read the lines out of that file. And just because its answer wasn't doing that. Okay, so we have something now. So let's try it out. Python syslog to json.py syslog sample. Okay. I didn't say JSON-L, so it put them in a list. That's okay. Seems believable. Yeah, piped it for JQ for some color, but that seems pretty nice. I'll call it a success. It's close enough. We could have... so now we have a script, which is really nice because we can run this script against any number of syslog entries without, paying for the context, having to go in to send it to the model. It's going to be much faster than having to use the model. We could have just used the model too. We could have done something like syslog sample, and -C is just saying include that content. I could have piped it too. It doesn't really matter. Or I could have used the attach. In this case, it wouldn't matter to use attach. Oh, wait, what am I doing? Not use the Python tool. Convert the provided syslog entries to a JSON format. Oh, I didn't T it anywhere, but it'll just write the standard out. So this is, if we wanted to not have it write a script to do it, we could also just ask it to do it. And it might do it a little differently because we weren't very specific. You do have to be very specific with asking LLMs to code, otherwise they don't do what you want them to do. But for the demo purpose, I don't think it's that important. There we have it. It's very similar to the other one. Also a list of dicts there. So yeah, so just examples of how that kind of works. I mean, I'd like to show tools too, just because I think that's pretty helpful. So if we do layer-m OpenAI util -t, and I don't think I showed this, so just to help if anyone wants to see. So if we do util -t to enable tools, and then we could do something like this will have, because I know for a fact that this will have the search tool and the news tool. So let's ask for news on something. Please provide the latest headlines in news about robots, and we should probably ask it to give some details, include titles, dates, and a short summary. If we wanted to have it actually evaluate the results in some way, say, does it contain anything about that? We could ask it a lot of details here and build something out. And in this case, we probably are fine with markdown output, so I'm going to put -m to allow the markdown output. So you could see, you could turn this off if you didn't want to see it, but it's just showing what's going on there. This is truncated, but it's showing it queried robots using the search news tool, It got back a whole lot of results. It then would have gone to each of the websites and gotten a summary script from it. So these things come in pretty handy, and you could use any of the tools. So if you had some task that needed for it to run terminals or Python code or whatever, everything just kind of works. And coding tasks as well. Okay, I'd like to give an example of the session stuff. I feel like that's a pretty useful thing to go over. So let's just look at the help again very quickly. And then I'm going to do layer-m llama 3.2. I have the 3B model, which is a pretty tiny model, so keep your expectations low. And the end part over there is just because I've modified it to have a bigger context window, in changing the default in OLlama. Util, and I'm going to use -a to attach a file, and I have a couple PDFs in here. Okay, this one's a text file, but it would be exactly the same if it was a PDF. And we could say this document is actually an old U.S. intelligence thing, I think from the 1940s, although I could be wrong. An old document about how to do sabotage. So please summarize the key points of the document. And -m because we want to allow markdown. And then the fun part, we want to allow it to create a session if it doesn't exist. And we want to use a session ID or alias. So because we don't have a session already, we're just going to put this in here. Sabotage. So it should create a new session with the alias sabotage is what that means. Okay, and let's see what happens. And that is a terrible answer. Let's just give it another run. If that doesn't work, we'll try the temperature changes. Like I said, we're using a 3B model here, so you can't have high expectations. Okay, I'll take it. Sabotaging communication systems can disrupt morale, create confusion for the enemy, including telephone switchboards, telegraph lines, spreading rumors, demoralizing enemy personnel, all sorts of fun things. So now it's in a session though. So if we go into Lair chat and we look at here, here's a session called sabotage. We could switch to it. We could view, let me do it the right way so you could see what I'm doing. So you could actually see when I ran history, it's including everything in there. The whole file, because it's a text file, it just puts it in that way. And then the AI responds, and the response that we've already seen. And we could continue the conversation here if we wanted, but let's go back to the util command. And I'm just going to run layer util-help again, just so we could see this. I think it might come in handy. And then if we go back over here, let's ask it another question. What should we ask? What techniques does the document advise for clogging a sewage system? And I think we need one more parameter here. We're going to do a -r, which makes it a read-only session, meaning it's not going to append to the history. So if we had multiple queries like this, the query, we could ask as many as we want, and it's just going to keep reusing that same context from before again, which it's not going to keep growing and getting worse. And now we'll learn some good stuff, hopefully. Add obstructions such as rocks and closed valves to clog the sewage flow. Use materials like hair, paper, and sponge to create blockages. Pour water or salt water into the oil tank. Good stuff. So I think that gives a pretty good example there. In closing, I meant for this to be like a 15-minute video. It got a little out of hand. I hope it's useful to somebody. I really recommend you look at the README-MD in the repository for more details on a lot of this stuff. There's a lot of different examples in there than what we went over here, and some more detailed examples which might be helpful. If you have a feature request or a bug report, GitHub issues is a good place to do it. No guarantees on anything getting addressed, but I'd love to hear what people are saying and what people would like to see. And anyway, hope someone finds this useful. Thanks for watching.